You are conscious right now. You are aware of these words. You are aware of the space around you, the feeling of your body, the fact that you are here and something is happening. That experience, the raw fact of it, is the most familiar thing in your life. It is also the one thing that science cannot explain. Not yet. Not even close. Here is what that means. Cosmologists can trace the origin of the universe back to within fractions of a second after it began. Physicists can describe the structure of matter at scales far smaller than any instrument can directly measure. Geologists can read 56 million years of planetary history from a thin layer of rock. But ask why your experience of reading these words feels like anything from the inside. And the answer is a formal open question with no agreed framework, no leading candidate, and no clear path to resolution. More is understood about the first moments of the universe than about why there is something it is like to be you. That asymmetry should stop you. It does not get discussed enough. This is not a philosophical curiosity sitting at the edge of real science. It is the most fundamental unsolved problem in all of science. Everything else science studies. It studies from the outside. Consciousness is the one thing that studies itself. That is not a small distinction. That is the whole problem. Here is what scientists can explain. They can explain attention. They can explain how the brain filters incoming information and directs resources toward specific signals. They can explain memory formation, sensory processing, language, decision-making. They can map which regions of the brain activate when you recognize a face, feel pain, hear music. All of that is tractable. Hard, but tractable. These are what the philosopher David Chalmers called the easy problems. Not easy in the sense of simple, but easy in the sense that they are, in principle, the kind of thing science knows how to approach. You identify a function, you find the mechanism, you explain it. The hard problem is different in kind. It is not a function, it is a fact. The fact that all of that neural processing, all of that firing, filtering, integrating, feels like something from the inside. Why does seeing red produce a subjective experience of redness? Why is there something it is like to be in pain rather than simply a signal that tissue is damaged? You can describe the entire chain of physical events and leave that question completely untouched. That gap is the hard problem. And it is hard not because the data is incomplete, but because it is not obvious that more data addresses it at all. What this series is going to do is trace the question from the bottom up. We will go back to single-celled organisms, to the question of whether the precursors of consciousness reach all the way to the origin of life. We will move through the Cambrian Explosion 540 million years ago, when complex animal bodies and the first real brains appeared, and examine the argument that this is when consciousness switched on in the vertebrate lineage. We will look at what vision may have had to do with it. We will look at which animals have it, and what the scientific institutions have been reluctant to say clearly. We will examine the two major modern theories, global workspace theory and integrated information theory, and we will be honest about where each one stops working. And at the end of all of that, the answer will still be incomplete. That is not a failure of the series. That is the accurate description of where the science actually is. There is one more thing worth establishing before any of that begins. The thing asking this question is the thing the question is about. You are using your consciousness to investigate consciousness. Every theory ever proposed was built inside the very phenomenon it was trying to explain. That circularity is not an accident. It is not a problem that better methodology will dissolve. It is a structural feature of the inquiry, and it may be the most important fact about this entire subject. Every other scientific question allows the investigator to stand outside the thing being studied. This one does not. That constraint shapes everything that follows. So we have a phenomenon that is universal among the people asking about it, undetectable from the outside, unmeasurable in any direct sense, and causally entangled with every attempt to study it. And the reason nobody has closed that gap is not that the question is too young. It is that the question may be too deep for the tools we are currently using to ask it. Before you can understand what it means for consciousness to have an origin, you need to understand what consciousness actually is. And the answer is more slippery than it sounds. Most people assume they know what consciousness is because they have it. You are awake. You are aware. Something is happening right now as you process these words. And that something feels like something. That feeling, the simple fact that there is an inside to your experience at all, is exactly what the problem is about. And the moment you try to say precisely what it is, it starts to come apart. Here is a useful distinction. There are things the brain does that scientists can study directly. Attention, memory, learning, perception, behavior, the ability to report on your own mental states. These are what the philosopher David Chalmers called the easy problems. They are not easy in practice. Decades of research, thousands of papers, enormous amounts of still unresolved detail, but they are easy in principle. They are functions. You can ask what neural mechanism performs them, build a model, test the model against data. Progress is possible, and progress has happened. Neuroscience has made substantial headway on all of them. Then there is the other thing. Not what the brain does, but why it feels like anything when it does it. Why does processing visual information produce the specific redness of red, rather than just a computed output with no experiential quality attached? Why does physical pain not just trigger avoidance behavior, but actually hurt? You can describe every mechanism involved in either case with perfect technical accuracy, and you have still left something out. The part you left out is the part that is actually there when you are the one seeing or hurting. That is the hard problem. Chalmers named it formally in the 1990s, not because nobody had noticed the puzzle before, philosophers have been circling it for centuries, but because he drew a precise line between the problems that looked hard and actually had tractable solutions, and the one problem that seemed to resist solution in a different and more fundamental way. The hard problem is not a gap in the data. It is a structural problem with how physical explanation works. Think about how science normally explains something. You identify a phenomenon, you find the mechanism that produces it, and the explanation is complete. That approach works for almost everything. It works for digestion, for combustion, for evolution, for the formation of stars. It even works for the easy problems of consciousness. Find the mechanism, trace the pathway. The explanation closes. Now apply it to the hard problem. You find every mechanism. You trace every pathway. You map the entire cascade from photon hitting retina to neural firing in the visual cortex to behavioral response. And at the end of all that, you have explained what the brain does in response to light. You have not explained why there is something it is like to see. The explanation does not close. The inside fact remains outside the description. This is what Chalmers meant when he said that reductive explanation fails for consciousness. In a way, it does not fail for anything else. It is not that we lack the data. It is that even a complete data set would leave the central question untouched. A future neuroscience that mapped every synapse, every oscillation, every electrochemical signal in a functioning human brain in real time would still face this. There is no line in that map that says here is where the experience lives. Not because the map is incomplete, but because experience is not the kind of thing that shows up in a map of physical processes. Here is an analogy. A fire burns down a building. Afterward, you examine the site with every tool available. Ash composition, heat signatures in the surrounding soil, the direction the char spreads across the floor. You can reconstruct the fire precisely. You can determine where it started, how fast it moved, how hot it burned. What you cannot recover from the ash is what it was like to stand next to that fire while it was burning. The heat on your skin, the specific quality of the light. That experience existed. It was real. It left no trace that analysis can recover. The physical record is complete, and the experiential fact is simply absent from it. Consciousness is the same structure. The brain is the ash. The mechanisms are all there, available for study, and neuroscience is genuinely good at reading them. But the fire, the actual experience, is not recoverable from the physical record alone, and more detailed physical records do not change that. More brain scanning is not going to close this. Better imaging is not going to close this. Those tools are extraordinary for the easy problems, and they are the wrong tool entirely for the hard one. That distinction is not academic. Because what you find when you trace the entire history of consciousness research from early philosophy through modern neuroscience is a persistent pattern. Researchers make progress. Real, substantial, verifiable progress. They explain more and more of what the brain does. And periodically someone steps back and points out that none of that progress has touched the central question, why any of this processing has an inside at all. And the field does not know what to do with that observation. It notes it. It moves on. The gap stays open. Every major theory that has been proposed since either solves the easy problems and declares victory, or acknowledges the hard problem and tries to find a way around it, and none of them has fully succeeded. Long before any creature had a brain, before anything had a nervous system, before multicellular life existed at all, something was already happening in the chemistry of living things that would eventually become the problem we are trying to solve. Go back far enough, and the Earth has no animals on it, no vertebrates, no invertebrates, no organisms with anything resembling coordinated neural tissue. What it does have, for billions of years before any of that, is single-celled life. Bacteria, archaea, microscopic organisms with no brain, no neurons, no internal wiring of any kind. And here is where the question gets uncomfortable. Because those organisms are not simply sitting there. They move. They sense chemical gradients in their environment and track toward food. They detect toxins and retreat. They communicate with neighboring cells by releasing chemicals that carry information across the colony. They form biofilms, coordinated communities with distributed behavior that responds to conditions no individual cell is registering on its own. That is sensing. That is learning. That is memory, in the functional sense of the word. The question is whether any of it is experience. This distinction matters more than it might seem. Behavior and consciousness are not the same thing. An organism can detect, respond, and adapt without there being anything it is like to be that organism. The hard problem, as laid out earlier, is precisely this gap between function and felt experience. So when scientists look at bacterial behavior and ask whether consciousness could be rooted this deep in life's history, they are not asking whether bacteria do interesting things. They clearly do. The question is whether anything is home. Arthur Reber, a psychologist, proposed an answer to that in 2016. His cellular basis of consciousness theory makes a direct claim. Sentience, he argues, did not arrive with brains. It arrived with life. The first living cells, on his account, were already conscious in some primitive sense, and everything that followed, every nervous system, every brain, every flicker of subjective experience, in every animal that has ever existed, is built on that original foundation. The cellular structures he points to are specific, excitable membranes, which generate and propagate electrical signals across the cell surface, oscillating cytoskeletal polymers, protein structures inside the cell that flex and shift in ways that may carry information, structurally flexible proteins that change shape in response, to molecular signals. These are not metaphors. They are real, identifiable hardware. Reber's argument is that this hardware is where experience begins, not in the cortex, not in the brainstem, not even in the synapse, but in the chemistry of the cell itself. The theory has a certain clarity to it. If consciousness is a biological phenomenon subject to evolution, and if evolution works by gradual modification of existing structures, then it cannot have appeared suddenly in complex animals. It has to have a lineage. The cellular basis of consciousness theory takes that seriously, and follows the logic all the way back. Sentience evolved from simpler sentience, which evolved from simpler sentience still, which means somewhere at the bottom of that chain is the first moment anything felt, anything at all. Reber places that moment at the origin of cellular life, roughly 4 billion years ago. Here is the problem. Sensing, reacting, communicating, moving. Those are the behaviors Reber uses as evidence, and every one of them is present in systems we do not consider conscious at all. A thermostat senses temperature and responds. A self-driving car detects obstacles, adjusts its course, communicates with other systems, and moves through an environment. By the behavioral criteria Reber applies to bacteria, a modern autonomous vehicle meets the bar, almost certainly more impressively than any single cell does. It integrates more information. It responds to more complex inputs. Its behavior is more flexible and context-sensitive. And nobody seriously argues that a self-driving car has subjective experience. That comparison is not a dismissal of the theory. It is a genuine problem the theory has to answer. Because if the evidence for bacterial consciousness rests on behavior alone, and machines exhibit more sophisticated versions of that same behavior, then the behavioral evidence is doing less work than it appears to. Something is missing from the account. Either behavior is not actually the right indicator, or there is something specific about biological cells that matters beyond what they do, some intrinsic property of living chemistry that is not present in silicon and code. Reber would say yes, there is, and it has to do with the specific structures he identifies, but the question of why those structures generate experience, rather than simply processing information, runs directly into the hard problem again. We are back where we started. What the cellular basis of consciousness theory does establish, even if you reject the strong claim about bacteria, is that the functional precursors to consciousness are genuinely ancient. The capacity to sense an environment, to register a difference and act on it, to store something like a learned response. These are not inventions of complex brains. They predate brains by billions of years. The building blocks were present long before any structure existed to assemble them into what we recognize as experience. Whether those building blocks constitute consciousness in any meaningful sense, or whether they are simply the raw materials out of which consciousness was eventually constructed, is exactly the question that the subsequent history of life on Earth has to answer. The building blocks are real, and they are ancient. The question is whether they are enough, or whether something else had to happen first. 540 million years ago, something changed. Not gradually, not over hundreds of millions of years of slow accumulation. By geological standards, it was sudden. The Cambrian Explosion is what scientists call it, and the name is accurate. In a window of roughly 20 million years, which sounds long until you compare it to the 3 billion years of life that came before it, complex animal life diversified at a rate the fossil record had never seen. New body plans, new nervous systems, new ways of moving through the world and responding to it. The question this section is about is whether consciousness arrived in that window too, and the answer most researchers now accept is yes. Not human consciousness, not anything close to it, but the original version, the first edition. Before the Cambrian, animal life was mostly sessile. That word is worth sitting with. Sessile means fixed in place. The dominant animal forms were filter feeders, organisms that anchored themselves to a surface and waited for nutrients to come to them. They did not pursue, they did not flee. They had no reason to build a unified model of their surroundings because their surroundings did not require a response. You do not need to know where you are if you are not going anywhere. The Cambrian changed that equation entirely. Predation appeared, pursuit appeared, escape appeared, and with those things came an entirely new set of demands on whatever nervous system an organism had. You cannot chase prey if your visual field and your motor system are operating independently. You cannot flee a predator if the signal that something dangerous is behind you takes too long to reach the part of your body that decides which direction to run. The organisms that could integrate sensory information faster, more accurately, and into a coherent real-time picture of their environment survived. The ones that could not were eaten. That selection pressure, applied relentlessly over millions of generations, is the leading candidate for what built consciousness. Here is the part that tends to get underemphasized. Consciousness, on this account, did not evolve because awareness is intrinsically valuable. It evolved because controlling a complex body in motion through a three-dimensional environment full of things that want to eat you is an engineering problem, a hard one. The solution that evolution arrived at was a system that integrates inputs from multiple senses into a single, unified, real-time model of space, self, and threat. That system is what we call consciousness. It started as infrastructure, the felt quality of it, the fact that there is something it is like to be the organism running that model, is either a byproduct of that integration or the thing that makes the integration work. That debate has not been resolved, but the functional origin is reasonably well established. Fossil evidence puts the emergence of vertebrates at approximately 520 million years ago. Genetic analysis converges on the same period. These were not large, impressive creatures by any standard we would recognize. Tiny, wriggling animals competing with a vast range of invertebrate forms in shallow seas. But they had something the sessile filter feeders did not. They had centralized nervous systems organized around the integration of sensory information. They had, in rudimentary form, brains. And the argument from several research groups working in evolutionary neuroscience is that this was not simply the hardware coming online before consciousness arrived. The hardware and the consciousness came together, because the hardware was built to produce exactly that result. What does it mean to say consciousness is in the genes? It means that the genetic instructions for building the neural structures associated with conscious perception, the isomorphically organized processing systems, the mechanisms of sensory integration, the reticular formation responsible for attention and awareness, appear across all vertebrates, every fish, every amphibian, every reptile, bird and mammal. The same underlying blueprint, modified and elaborated over 500 million years, but recognizable as a continuous lineage. When geneticists look for the genes that pattern these structures, they find them, not just in mammals, not just in animals with large cortices, in all of them. Now here is what that means for the question. If consciousness were a late invention, something that emerged only in animals with sufficiently large and complex brains, you would expect the neural mechanisms supporting it to appear suddenly at some point in the vertebrate record and be absent before that point. That is not what the evidence shows. What it shows instead is that the core architecture was present from the beginning of the vertebrate lineage and has been modified, but not invented since. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a group of prominent neuroscientists, made this explicit. The neurobiological substrates necessary for conscious experience are not uniquely human. They are present in all vertebrates and in some invertebrates. That declaration did not get the attention it deserved, but the underlying point stands. The brains of vertebrates are 6 to 10 times larger, relative to body size, than the brains of comparably sized invertebrates from the same period. That scaling is not free. It costs enormous metabolic resources to build and maintain. Evolution does not sustain expensive structures unless they are earning their cost. The integrated conscious model of the environment was apparently worth that cost, because every vertebrate lineage has kept paying it for 500 million years. And the thing that keeps getting missed in accounts of this history is the continuity. Consciousness is not something humans invented or that mammals stumbled onto. It is something that entered the vertebrate lineage during the Cambrian Explosion and has been present in every member of that lineage since. The lamprey swimming in a cold river right now is running a version of the same system you are running. Simpler, more limited, but the same system, built from the same genetic instructions, shaped by the same original selection pressures. Consciousness, on this reading, is not a late addition to the story of life on Earth. It is something that has been present in vertebrate animals since the beginning of vertebrate animals, written into the genome and expressed in every creature that has ever had a spine. Of all the senses, vision may have been the one that started the whole thing. That is not an obvious claim. Hearing works faster than vision in some contexts. Touch is more immediately tied to survival. Pain comes before any coherent image forms. So why vision? Here is the argument. Vision requires the brain to build something that the other senses do not strictly demand. A spatial model. A unified continuous map of where things are relative to the organism perceiving them. To hear a predator is useful. To see a predator is to place it in a world, to track its movement through space, to model its trajectory and your own at the same time. That kind of integration, binding location, motion, distance and identity into one coherent picture, may be exactly the kind of neural work that tipped single sensory processing into something that feels like being somewhere. That distinction matters. There is a difference between a system that detects and a system that perceives. Detection is input. Perception is a model. And building that model, researchers have argued, is where subjective experience entered the picture. The fossil and genetic record places the origin of vertebrate vision at roughly 520 million years ago, right at the center of the Cambrian Explosion. Eyes appeared fast by evolutionary standards, and complex image-forming eyes in particular seem to have driven an arms race between predators and prey that accelerated the development of neural processing across the board. Andrew Parker's hypothesis, the light switch theory, proposes that the sudden appearance of image-forming vision in the Cambrian triggered the entire explosion of complex animal diversity. Whether or not that specific claim holds in full, the correlation is real. Eyes and brains developed together, not by coincidence. Now here is where the neuroscience gets specific, and specific in a way that changes how you think about the whole problem. In early vertebrates, the center of visual processing and multimodal sensory integration is not the cerebral cortex, it is the optic tectum. That is a structure in the midbrain, part of the brainstem. Fish have it, amphibians have it, lampreys have it, and researchers studying the evolution of consciousness have proposed that this is where subjective experience first lived. Not in a cortex, not in some elaborate higher brain region, in the midbrain, in a structure that vertebrates have been carrying for 500 million years. Here is what makes that significant. If the optic tectum was the seat of conscious perception in early vertebrates, then consciousness did not originate as a cortical phenomenon. It originated much deeper, in older neural architecture, and the cerebral cortex came later. What this means is a two-step evolutionary history. Step 1. The optic tectum integrates vision with the other senses, sound, touch, balance, into a unified map of the environment, and that unified map is where experience begins. Step 2. As brains grew larger and more complex in the lineage leading to mammals, reptiles, and birds, the center of conscious processing gradually shifted from the midbrain to the dorsal pallium and eventually to the cerebral cortex. The cortex did not invent consciousness. It inherited it and expanded it. That shift in emphasis is not a minor technical detail. It is a structural reframing of the entire question. Most discussions of consciousness treat the cortex as the origin point. The data suggests it is a later stage of a much older story. And the organism that illustrates this most clearly is not a human, not a chimpanzee, not even a dog. It is a lamprey. The lamprey is a jawless, eel-shaped vertebrate that diverged from the main vertebrate lineage around 500 million years ago. It has no cerebral cortex. It has no neocortex of any kind. What it has is an optic tectum, a functional visual system, and a full set of the neural structures that researchers have identified as the minimum hardware for sensory consciousness. The lamprey meets the criteria. It processes visual information, integrates it with other sensory input, and uses that integrated model to navigate and respond to the world. The hypothesis on the table is that a lamprey has genuine qualia, genuine subjective experience, something it is like to be a lamprey, even if that something is minimal and completely unlike anything a human would recognize as experience. That is uncomfortable for most people. It should be. Because if the lamprey is conscious, then consciousness is not rare. It is not a late, unlikely development in the history of life. It is something that has been present in vertebrate animals since before jaws existed, before limbs existed, before anything we would recognize as a brain in the colloquial sense appeared. And this is exactly the point that intuition consistently resists. We tend to think of consciousness as binary. You have it, or you do not. That binary assumption is not supported by the evolutionary record. What the record shows is gradation, degrees. The lamprey has some, the frog has more, the crow has considerably more, and the accumulation has been ongoing for 500 million years, built on the same basic architecture that started in the midbrain of a fish-like creature in a Cambrian ocean. Consciousness is not a threshold crossed once. It is a property that deepened incrementally, built on prior structures, never starting over. A lamprey is not a person, and its experience of the world is nothing like yours. But between you and that lamprey, 500 million years of evolution did not create consciousness from scratch. It just kept building on what was already there. In 2012, a group of prominent neuroscientists signed a document at the University of Cambridge that should have been a bigger headline than it was. The document was called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. It was signed at a conference on consciousness in human and non-human animals, and its conclusion was direct. The neurobiological structures required to support conscious experience are not uniquely human. Non-human animals possess them. Birds possess them. Mammals possess them. Fish possess them. And depending on how seriously you take the criteria, certain invertebrates, octopuses, insects, crustaceans, may possess functional versions of them as well. This was not a fringe publication. These were credentialed researchers, working scientists, people with laboratories and funding and careers invested in understanding how brains work. And what they signed off on formally in writing was that consciousness is not a human invention. Here is what that actually means. For the better part of modern science, the working assumption embedded in research programs, in ethics review boards, in animal testing frameworks, in the entire architecture of how we treat non-human life, has been that consciousness is essentially a human property. Other animals have behavior, they have reactions, they have neural activity, but the inner experience, the felt quality of being something, has been treated as a human matter, or at most a mammalian one, and even then handled cautiously. The Cambridge Declaration did not gently suggest that this assumption needed revisiting. It said the assumption was wrong. Now here is the question that should have followed. If the neurobiological hardware for conscious experience is not uniquely human, and if that hardware is present across birds and mammals and fish and possibly insects, what does that mean for every institution that built its frameworks on the opposite premise? That question did not get asked loudly. The declaration was covered. Scientists acknowledged it. Yet the scientific community's attention shifted to other ground. No major restructuring of research ethics, no urgent reassessment of what obligations follow from the finding, no funded programs designed to map the actual distribution of conscious experience across species. 7 years after the PETM paper, the silence there looked like a signal. The silence here looks like the same thing. Not coordination, not conspiracy. Institutional inertia. Nobody wants to be the person who takes this finding to its logical conclusion and finds out what that costs. Before you can evaluate why that silence matters, you need to understand what tool researchers have actually used to try to identify consciousness in non-human animals. One of the more rigorous frameworks is something called unlimited associative learning, or UAL. The idea is straightforward in principle and demanding in practice. An organism with UAL can form new associations between different types of stimuli, across different contexts, and retain those associations for flexible future use. Not reflexes, not conditioned responses to a single repeated stimulus. Real contextual learning, the kind that requires integrating information across sensory systems, storing it in memory, and deploying it in novel situations. The argument is that this capacity requires exactly the kind of neural integration that underlies conscious awareness. Where UAL is present, consciousness is likely present. That is the positive test. What makes this uncomfortable is where the test comes back positive. Insects meet many of the criteria, not all of them, and researchers are careful about that. But many. Bees demonstrate associative learning across contexts. Fruit flies show memory retention that goes beyond simple conditioning. The neural architecture involved is compact but not primitive, and if you follow the UAL framework honestly, you cannot dismiss these results. You either accept that something like minimal conscious experience may be present in insects, or you revise the criteria. What you cannot do is hold both positions at once, that UAL is a reliable marker of consciousness, and that insects clearly lack consciousness, without acknowledging the contradiction. Here is the part that should stop you. We are not talking about a theoretical edge case. Insects represent the largest category of animals on Earth by number of species and by population. If minimal conscious experience extends into that group, the ethical implications are not small. They are enormous. And the research programs that currently treat insect nervous systems as irrelevant to questions of experience would need to be reconsidered from the ground up. That is not a comfortable position for any institution to be in. The professional cost of taking it seriously is asymmetric, exactly as it was with the geological question from the PATM paper. Follow the finding and you absorb the full weight of what it requires. Stay quiet and nothing changes for you personally. So the finding sits, published, acknowledged, technically available to anyone who looks, and operationally ignored by the structures that would need to act on it. This is not unique to consciousness research. But consciousness research is where the stakes are highest, because what is at stake is not a geological timeline or a carbon budget. It is the question of what counts as an experiencing subject, and what obligations that creates. We drew those lines around humans, then we moved them slightly to include certain mammals. The Cambridge Declaration suggested the lines were in the wrong place entirely, that experience is older and more widespread than the frameworks assumed. We have not seriously updated those frameworks in response, which is not unusual, but it is worth sitting with, because the pattern of acknowledging an uncomfortable finding and then not following it anywhere has consequences. Here is the thing about the evolutionary history of consciousness that the textbooks do not say directly. Knowing when consciousness emerged does not tell you what consciousness is. Those are two completely different questions. And the field has spent decades treating progress on the first one as though it were progress on the second. We now have a reasonable picture of the timeline. Vertebrates acquired the neural architecture for conscious experience roughly 520 million years ago. The capacity is encoded in the genome. It is distributed across species. Fish have it. Birds have it. The lamprey, one of the oldest living vertebrates, almost certainly has it in some form. That is a significant scientific achievement. It tells us when the property appeared in life on Earth and in which lineages it persisted. What it does not tell us is why that property feels like anything from the inside. And that is the hard problem. It did not go away because we found the fossil record of consciousness. It became stranger. Here is what I mean by that. Think about what it takes to fully describe what happens in a brain when a person sees something red. You can map the photons hitting the retina. You can trace the signal through the optic nerve into the visual cortex. You can identify which neurons fire, in what sequence, at what frequency. You can describe the whole cascade in precise, measurable, reproducible detail. And when you are finished, you have described everything that happens in the brain. You have not explained why any of it feels like red. The redness, the specific quality of that experience from the inside, is not in the description. It is nowhere in the data. You can have a complete functional account of color perception and still be standing at the edge of the hard problem with nowhere to go. That gap has a name. Philosophers call it the explanatory gap. On one side is the third-person language of neuroscience. Activation patterns, neural correlates, measurable outputs. On the other side is the first-person fact of experience. What it is actually like to be the thing having the experience. There is no known bridge between those two sides. Not a partial bridge, not a bridge under construction. No bridge. The tools that work on one side of the gap are the wrong tools for the other side. And that asymmetry is not a temporary limitation. It may be a permanent structural feature of how physical explanation works. Now here is where the philosophical zombie becomes useful. Not as a science fiction scenario, as a test of what physical description can and cannot do. Imagine a creature that is identical to you in every physical and functional respect. Same neurons, same structure, same behavior, same outputs. It processes information the way you process information. It responds to stimuli the way you respond to stimuli. The only difference is that there is nothing it is like to be that creature. No inner experience, no felt quality to anything, just processing, all the way down. The question is whether that scenario is conceivable without logical contradiction. And the uncomfortable answer is yes. It appears to be coherent. You can describe it without running into an obvious impossibility. That matters. If a creature identical to you in every physical detail could in principle exist without any inner experience, then the physical description is not capturing everything. Something is being left out. What is being left out is consciousness itself. This is not a popular conclusion in certain parts of the field. Some researchers argue the philosophical zombie scenario is incoherent on closer inspection, that once you have fully specified all the physical and functional facts, you have implicitly included consciousness. Daniel Dennett holds something like this position. His argument is that the hard problem dissolves once you are precise enough about what you are actually asking. The redness of red is not a property over and above the brain's processing of certain wavelengths. Once you describe the processing completely, you have described the experience. There is no residue. Nothing is being left out. The counter-argument is direct. Dennett's position requires you to accept that the most immediate and certain thing you have access to, the felt quality of your own experience, is less trustworthy than the third-person account. It requires you to conclude that the inside view is either an illusion or a redescription of the outside view, and many people find that conclusion harder to accept than the hard problem itself. Because whatever the brain is doing, there is a first-person fact about what it is like to be you right now, reading this. And that fact does not appear anywhere in a neuroscience paper. So the responses to the hard problem sort into roughly 3 categories. First, deny it as a real problem. Argue that functional explanation is complete explanation, that the inside view will dissolve once the science is precise enough. Second, accept the problem as real, but assume it is tractable, that some new physical or informational framework will eventually close the gap. Third, conclude that physical explanation is fundamentally incomplete, that something radical is required, whether that means panpsychism, dualism, or a reconceptualization of what counts as a scientific explanation at all. None of these positions has won. The field has been running this argument since at least the 1990s, when Chalmers formally named the problem, and the debate has not narrowed. More brain imaging has not closed it. More evolutionary history has not closed it. The framework of the argument is exactly where it was 30 years ago, with better data on all sides and the same gap in the middle. And the fact that 500 million years of evolution and a century of neuroscience have not closed it is not evidence that the gap is small. It may be evidence that the gap is structural. In 1988, a cognitive scientist named Bernard Baars proposed a framework for consciousness that started with a simple question nobody had asked cleanly before. How does a single, unified, limited stream of consciousness emerge from a brain that is mostly parallel, distributed, and running enormous amounts of processing all at once? The brain handles millions of operations simultaneously. Consciousness handles one thing at a time. That gap is not a minor technical detail. It is one of the most important structural facts about the mind. And before Baars, nobody had built a formal framework around it. The answer Baars proposed is called global workspace theory. The core idea is simpler than it sounds. Think of the mind as a theatre. The stage is lit by a spotlight. Whatever falls inside that spotlight is conscious, available to the whole system, reportable, attended to. Everything outside the spotlight is dark. The audience sits in that darkness. They are processing information continuously, feeding signals into the system, responding to what happens on stage, but they are not conscious. They are the unconscious components of the brain doing their work without any first-person awareness attached to it. And behind the scenes, there are figures shaping the performance. The director, the playwright, the stagehands, none of whom ever step into the light themselves. They influence what appears in consciousness without being conscious of doing it. That is the architecture. The spotlight is the global workspace. What gets illuminated is what becomes conscious experience. Here is what makes this framework useful. It explains things that other models could not handle cleanly. It explains why consciousness has a bandwidth problem. The spotlight is narrow. You cannot consciously attend to everything at once. You read these words, and your peripheral vision exists but is not in focus. You are aware of sound in the room only until something pulls your attention toward it. The limitation is not a flaw in the system. It is a design feature. The global workspace was never built to process everything. It was built to select what matters and broadcast it. What gets selected? Baars and subsequent researchers found that certain kinds of information reliably break through into the global workspace. Novel stimuli. urgent signals, inputs that cross multiple sensory systems at once. If something is sudden, unexpected, or emotionally significant, it competes effectively for the spotlight. Routine, predictable processing stays dark. Your brain is managing your balance, your breathing, your posture, the recognition of familiar objects. None of this requires the global workspace. It runs quietly in the audience. The spotlight is reserved for what the organism actually needs to respond to consciously. That last point connects directly to evolution. A global workspace system is not an arbitrary design. It makes biological sense as a coordination mechanism. Before global workspace theory, the standard picture of the brain was a collection of specialized modules. Vision over here, language over there, motor control in another region, each doing its own processing without obvious integration. The problem with that picture is that organisms need unified responses. When a predator appears, the system that detects the movement, the system that identifies the threat, the system that coordinates the escape, and the system that suppresses irrelevant activity, all need to operate together, and fast. A global workspace solves that problem by broadcasting critical information to all specialized systems simultaneously. The whole organism gets the signal at once. The response can be coordinated. Consciousness, on this account, is not a passive observer of the brain's activity. It is the mechanism by which the brain achieves unified action. This is why global workspace theory attracted serious scientific attention and has held it for decades. It generates predictions. It maps onto known neural architecture. Neuroscientists have identified regions of the prefrontal and parietal cortex that appear to function as the global workspace, areas that light up when information becomes conscious and go quiet when it does not. The theory connects cognitive science, evolutionary biology, and neuroscience in a coherent picture of what consciousness is doing and why it exists. That is a genuine achievement. Most frameworks do not get this far. Now here is the problem. And it is the same problem we have been circling since the beginning of this series. Global workspace theory explains the function of consciousness. It does not explain the experience of consciousness. The theatre metaphor tells you what gets broadcast and why. It does not tell you why the spotlight feels like anything from the inside. Why is there something it is like to be in the light? Why does the information in the global workspace come with a first-person quality attached to it? A sense of presence, of awareness, of being the one who is seeing. The theory has no answer for that. It does not attempt one. That is not a criticism of the theory for failing to do something it never set out to do. It is a statement about what the theory is. A model of function. A. Description of architecture. A coherent account of selection and broadcast. What it is not is an explanation of why any of this processing is accompanied by experience at all. Why is the audience dark but the stage lit in a way that someone can feel? That question sits exactly where it was before Bars proposed the framework. The theatre is a useful model, and it captures something real. But it is a model of function, and the hard problem is not a problem about function. Giulio Tononi had a different idea, and it was either the most important theory in the history of consciousness research or a beautifully constructed dead end. And as of right now, the honest answer is that nobody is certain which. Where Bars asked what consciousness does, Tononi asked what consciousness is. That is a different question entirely. And the answer he proposed is this. Consciousness is identical to integrated information, not correlated with it, not produced by it, identical to it. A system is conscious to the precise degree that it integrates information as a whole, above and beyond what its parts generate separately. That degree can be calculated. It has a name. Tononi calls it phi. Here is what phi actually measures. Take any system, a brain, a simple circuit, a thermostat. Break it into its component parts and measure how much information each part generates on its own. Then measure how much information the whole system generates when those parts are working together. The difference between those two numbers is phi. If the whole generates significantly more than the sum of its parts, phi is high. If the parts are essentially independent and the whole is just their outputs running in parallel, phi is close to zero. High phi means high consciousness. Low phi means low or no consciousness. The claim is that this number, wherever you can calculate it, tells you how much subjective experience is present in that system. That is a remarkable claim. It means consciousness is not a special property that biology invented. It is a property of information structure. It can be quantified. In principle, it can be measured in anything. Tononi built the theory on 5 axioms. Consciousness exists. That is the starting point. The one fact you cannot deny without using consciousness to deny it. Consciousness has structure. Every experience has qualities, relationships, distinctions built into it. Consciousness is unique. Every experience is specific and different from every other possible experience. Consciousness is integrated. An experience is a whole thing, not a bundle of separate parts running at once. And consciousness is exclusive. Each experience is what it is, and nothing else at the same time. These are not empirical claims waiting to be tested. They are descriptions of what experience is like from the inside, taken as the foundation the theory has to explain from the outside. The reason serious neuroscientists have taken this seriously is that it actually addresses the hard problem, rather than stepping around it. Tononi is not just describing the functions of consciousness. He is proposing that consciousness has a physical identity, that it is integrated information, and that identity is why it feels like something. The subjective quality of experience, on this account, is what integrated information is from the inside. Christoph Koch, one of the most prominent neuroscientists in the field, has called IIT the only genuinely promising fundamental theory of consciousness. That is not a casual endorsement. If phi above zero means consciousness, then almost everything is conscious to some degree. A simple feedback loop has some phi. A single neuron has some phi. A thermostat responding to temperature has some phi. It is a small number, nearly nothing, but IIT says it is not zero. And if phi is not zero, something is there. This is panpsychism, the position that consciousness is not exclusive to brains or even to biology, but is a fundamental feature of any system that processes information in an integrated way. It comes in degrees, fading down toward nothing in very simple systems, but never quite reaching it. Most scientists find this deeply counterintuitive. There is a strong intuition that a thermostat experiences nothing, that a neuron firing is not having a moment of awareness. IIT says that intuition may be wrong, or at least imprecise. What it actually captures is that the thermostat's experience is so minimal, it barely registers as experience at all. But minimal is not zero. That distinction matters enormously for the theory. The counterargument is direct. Machines sense, react, and process information. We do not attribute consciousness to them. The self-driving car integrates more information across more domains than most insects. Is it more conscious than a bee? IIT would say that depends on the phi calculation, not on whether it seems biological. Many researchers are not comfortable following that logic, wherever it leads. There are other problems. Phi is extraordinarily difficult to calculate in practice. For a small neural circuit, it is tractable. For a human brain with 86 billion neurons and trillions of connections, a true phi calculation is computationally out of reach with current methods. The theory makes precise predictions in principle that cannot yet be tested in practice for the systems we care most about. And in certain configurations, IIT produces results that challenge common sense. Some highly parallel systems, like large interconnected grids, come out with lower phi than simpler, more tightly integrated ones, which produces counterintuitive rankings of which systems should be more conscious. Defenders of the theory accept these complications. The mathematics may be hard to apply, but that does not make the underlying framework wrong. Science routinely deals with theories that are correct in principle and intractable in practice. The question is whether phi captures something real about what consciousness is, not whether we can calculate it for every system today. Here is my position on that. This is a live scientific debate. The people who find IIT compelling are not making an obvious error. The people who find the panpsychist implications a reductio ad absurdum are not making an obvious error either. Both sides are looking at the same theory and drawing different conclusions about what a correct theory of consciousness is allowed to imply. Whether phi is the answer, part of the answer, or a sophisticated wrong turn is a question that will not be settled soon, and the fact that it is still genuinely open after decades of serious work tells you something about the size of the problem. Neither theory closes the gap. Global workspace theory tells you how the brain organizes conscious content. It tells you what gets selected, what gets broadcast, what stays dark. Integrated information theory gives you a number. It tells you how much integrated information a system contains, and claims that number corresponds directly to how much experience is present. Both frameworks are serious, both have real explanatory power, and both stop at exactly the same wall, the one that was identified in Section 2 and has not moved since. Neither one explains why any of this processing feels like something from the inside. That question is still open. That is the honest summary of where the field stands. Here is what the gap actually is. You can describe in complete detail what happens in a brain when someone looks at something red, the wavelength of light, the firing of photoreceptors, the cascade through the visual cortex, the activation patterns, the neural binding, the global broadcast. You can map every step with increasing precision. And at the end of that description, you have still not explained why there is something it is like to see red, why the experience has a quality, why it feels the way it feels and not some other way. That quality, the raw felt character of experience, is what philosophers call a qual. Qualia are not a metaphor. They are the specific thing that both theories fail to account for: the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the specific texture of a memory or a sound. These are not complications on the edge of the problem. They are the problem. Now here is my position on the standard response to that. Some scientists deny that qualia require special explanation. Daniel Dennett has argued for decades that what we call qualia are really just functional states that feel mysterious because of how our introspective systems work. On this view, there is no hard problem. Just a set of cognitive illusions about our own inner states that will dissolve once we understand the relevant brain mechanisms well enough. That is a coherent position. It has serious people behind it, and it requires you to deny the most direct and certain thing you have access to, which is that your experience right now feels like something. Whatever the brain is doing to produce this moment, there is a first-person fact about it. You know that fact, not because you inferred it, not because you measured it, but because you are having it. Third-person description does not capture that. It never has. And the argument that it eventually will requires a kind of faith in the completeness of physical explanation that the data does not currently support. This is where panpsychism enters the conversation, and it enters as something more than a fringe position. The argument runs like this. Consciousness cannot be derived from matter that has none. If you start with neurons and electrochemical signals, and you run the physical explanation forward, as far as it will go, you never get to why there is a felt quality to the result. So perhaps the mistake is assuming that matter has none. Perhaps experience is fundamental. Perhaps it goes all the way down, present in some minimal form at every level of physical reality, not just in brains. This connects directly to what IIT implies. If phi is consciousness, and any system with phi above zero has some degree of experience, then simple physical systems, not just neurons, not just animals, have a trace of something. Most scientists find this deeply counterintuitive. It sounds like it contradicts everything we know about the physical world, but the counterintuitive quality of a position is not evidence against it. The alternative, that experience somehow emerges from nothing that resembles experience, has its own profound explanatory problems, and those problems have been sitting in the literature for 30 years without resolution. Here is the part that does not get said directly enough. Every theory of consciousness faces a structural constraint that no other area of science faces in the same form. The researcher studying consciousness is not separate from the subject. You are not an astronomer examining a distant object through a telescope. You are the object. The tools you use to build and test any theory of consciousness, perception, reasoning, inference, memory, are themselves products of the very phenomenon under investigation. When you evaluate whether a theory of consciousness is correct, you are using consciousness to do the evaluation. When you design an experiment to test whether integrated information corresponds to experience, you are relying on your own experience to interpret the results. There is no external vantage point. There is no view from outside. Every measurement, every model, every framework is constructed from inside the thing being studied. That is not true of chemistry. It is not true of cosmology or genetics or neuroscience as applied to other questions. It is specifically true of consciousness, and the field has not fully reckoned with what that means. That circularity does not make the project impossible. Science has made real progress on the easy problems, and that progress is valuable. But it does mean that the standard tools of scientific inquiry may be hitting a structural limit here rather than just an empirical one. The gap between physical description and subjective experience is not closing because more papers are being published. It is not closing because the theories are getting more sophisticated. It remains open because the thing being described and the thing doing the describing are the same thing, and no amount of additional description gets around that. You are using the thing you are trying to explain to do the explaining, and at some point that constraint stops being a methodological inconvenience and starts being a clue about what kind of thing consciousness actually is. Here is the version of this problem that most theories do not reach, not because they miss it, but because it is almost impossible to say directly. Every theory discussed so far, global workspace theory, integrated information theory, every evolutionary account tracing consciousness back to the Cambrian, is built on the same assumption, that there is someone doing the building, a conscious mind formulating the question, running the model, checking the data against the prediction. The thing being studied and the instrument doing the studying are the same thing. That is unusual in science. It is actually unprecedented. And at a certain point, that fact stops being a footnote and becomes the central issue. Here is the question the theories tend to skip. If consciousness is the thing doing all the knowing, all the measuring, all the theorizing, all the deciding what counts as evidence, what does the universe look like without it? Not a universe with fewer conscious beings, a universe with none, no observers, no inside view anywhere. What is that? The honest answer is that there is no answer, not because the data is thin, because the question requires an inside view to ask, and in a universe with no consciousness, there is no inside view. The question cannot be formed, which means the question we are asking right now is only possible because the thing we are asking about already exists. That is not a solution to the hard problem, but it changes its shape considerably. This is the Anthropic Dimension. We can only ask what consciousness is because consciousness is here to ask. A universe that remained dark, never producing a single organism with subjective experience, would contain no one wondering why it was dark. The fact that the question exists at all is evidence that the answer is somewhere in this universe, in this lineage, in whatever happened 540 million years ago, when the first vertebrates developed the neural architecture for experience. That is either a trivial observation or a deeply strange one, depending on how long you sit with it. Now consider the timeline. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. The Cambrian Explosion happened roughly 540 million years ago. That means the universe ran for over 13 billion years before any part of it became aware of itself. Stars formed and collapsed. Galaxies collided. Planets cooled. Chemistry organized into biology. All of that happened. What was it like from the inside during those 13 billion years? The honest answer, nothing. There was no inside. Not because the events weren't real, but because there was nothing it was like to be any of them. That gap, 13 billion years of physical process with no interior dimension, is not something any current theory has a clean way to handle. If consciousness is emergent, a product of sufficiently complex information processing, then the universe simply had no consciousness until the right complexity appeared. That is coherent, but it does not explain why complexity produces experience rather than just more complexity. If consciousness is fundamental, present in some form at every level of physical reality the way mass or charge is present, then those 13 billion years were not entirely dark. Something was experiencing something, however primitively, in every particle interaction. That is a different universe than the one most scientists assume they are working in. And both positions are live. Options right now. Neither is settled. Here is what the geological record tells you about what survives. Not the story. The chemistry. After 50 million years, what remains of a civilization is isotope ratios and carbon signals locked in sediment. The buildings are gone. The language is gone. Whatever was experienced by the beings who built and spoke, gone. No trace. No fossil. No recoverable signal. The physical process leaves a mark. The experience of the physical process leaves nothing. Consciousness is like that. What survives the death of a conscious being is measurable. The structure of the brain, the pattern of neural connections, the physical trace of what happened. What does not survive is the only thing that actually was consciousness, the experience itself, the inside view. Whatever it was like to be that organism at the moment the brain was running, that is gone with no equivalent of an ash layer in the rock. There is no isotope ratio for qualia. There is no chemical fingerprint for the subjective fact of being aware. The thing that makes consciousness the hard problem is also the thing that makes it the only phenomenon in nature that leaves no record of what it fundamentally is. That is worth sitting with. Science proceeds by studying evidence. Evidence is third person, observable, measurable, reproducible. Consciousness is first person. The only direct access anyone has to it is from the inside, and the inside cannot be examined from the outside in any way that captures the thing itself. Every brain scan, every neural correlate study, every phi measurement is a third-person trace of a first-person fact. And the first-person fact, what it actually is, does not survive into the third-person account. Not partially, not approximately, not yet. It simply does not translate. Some researchers conclude from this that the hard problem will eventually yield to better tools and more complete neuroscience. Some conclude that the hard problem is revealing something fundamental about the nature of reality, that consciousness is not a product of the physical world in the way that temperature or pressure is, but something categorically different. That debate has not moved decisively in either direction in 30 years of serious work. The experience leaves no record of any kind. It exists entirely in the moment of its occurrence, and whatever the universe was doing for 13 billion years before consciousness appeared in it. There is no inside account of that time, and there never will be,